Good evening and welcome everyone to an evening about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel Studios. 33 films so far and more to come, multiple phases of storytelling covering Infinity Wars to multiverses, the second, sixth and 10th highest box office films of all time. Marvel is the phenomenon of 21st century cinema. No surprise then that the first major and substantive book about Marvel is called The Reign of Marvel Studios, because they have, after all, dominated the cinematic universe. And I'm pleased to say that two of the authors of this book, Dave Gonzales and Gavin Edwards, are here today. Sadly, the third, Joanna Robinson, can't join us. Dave, Gavin, thank you very much for joining us. Gavin, you're still muted, by the way. There you go. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Obviously, I just want to say very quickly to the audience beyond this virtual space, we welcome your questions. But the one thing I wanted to start off with, Dave and Gavin, is this. Marvel is clearly a phenomenon by any standards. In movie terms, it is ginormous. But over and above scale, what would you say was the biggest contribution, the most significant thing Marvel has achieved in terms of movie-going and cinema and screen storytelling? Dave, perhaps start with you.
Yeah, I would say probably one of the biggest things that it's achieved, and I think it's achieved a couple of banner things, but the one that interests me is this idea of a cinematic universe, or a universe that is built tightly enough around a intellectual property that everybody understands certain heroes are Marvel heroes and therefore can be in Marvel movies. That every movie that they release in sequence could be seen as a sequel to the previous movie. So it's a very cool narrative and, I believe, marketing trick to make sure that you're coming back for more and you're coming back for more. Even if you saw a conclusion you might have liked in a movie, there will be another Marvel movie down the road. So the idea that they started that in 2008 and they're still going, I think shows that they're very good at it, because you've seen so many other attempted cinematic universes shoot their shot and fall by the wayside, and Marvel's still chugging along.
What about you, Gavin? What would you distinguish as being one of the most distinctive aspects of the Marvel process?
Well, I'm going to build on what Dave said, because one of the amazing things about that is that it actually culminates. That there's been other movie series that have gone on. You're obviously accustomed to a trilogy, or even something like James Bond that goes on for a while. But the fact that 20 movies in, they were able to build up to Infinity War and Endgame and say everything that's come before, makes sense as one story that is actually we're going to have a crescendo. There's nothing like that ever in movie history, and the fact that they were able to pull that off is still, I think, just a really astonishing signal achievement.
In fact, they sort of effectively reconfigured this notion of the sequel, the franchise, into something far bigger, multiple chapters, interconnected storytelling. Was that, did you see that as being something that when Marvel launched the first of these films, Iron Man in 2008, that was always part of the plan, or did it seem to evolve, as it were, organically from once they watched what happened with that movie? What was your view? You've looked at this process very closely. Was there a grand scheme, or was it something that, as it were, happened and then grew like Topsy?
I mean, there was a grand scheme, but it was aspirational. That they fully intended, when they started Iron Man, they said, hey, if everything goes right and we can do a Hulk movie and we can do a Thor movie and a Captain America movie, oh my God, we would have the Avengers and we could do an Avengers movie. But it seemed just like a crazy remote bank shot, even to the people who are doing it, which is, by the way, why Robert Downey Jr. ended up getting about $50 million from the Avengers movies, because he had this clause, if you ever make this movie that we know really isn't going to happen, we'll pay you an absurd amount of money. And then it happened and he got the absurd amount of money.
Yeah, from a storytelling standpoint, I think it's really interesting that you have Iron Man, it ends with Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury. They had not signed him for multiple movies. They had to immediately afterwards because they realized that's how they would do storytelling. And then they sort of rushed to have this scene at the end of The Incredible Hulk, which they actually had the late William Hurt and Robert Downey Jr. improvise, which is hilariously funny because in terms of serialized storytelling, like Tony Stark wouldn't be talking to that guy. That guy doesn't have control over the Hulk. He has control of the Abomination. So they actually, once they realize that they're going to do this phase thing, once Iron Man and the Hulk allowed them to pay off the loan that they got to start Marvel Studios, that actually gives birth to the first Marvel one-shot, which was a DVD extra on the Thor movie, and it's called The Consultant, and it's just basically undoing the story of the Incredible Hulk post-credit scene because they realized it didn't make sense. They were sort of chasing the heat, not realizing they were telling a story. So through the end of 2008, it was still a pie in the sky. As soon as they saw those returns from Iron Man, and they saw that Iron Man was going to have the success it did in the summer of 2008, they had to sort of tighten the ship, and a bunch of the struggles up of the remainder of phase 1 and then in phase 2 is sort of how to keep this a story that feels like it doesn't have any loose ends, but also allow each movie to sort of exist on its own. And they did that with differing success for a while.
Before we get into some of the interesting business, organizational, structural details about how they did that, and as you say, some of it was by careful placing of Easter eggs, some of it was by careful improvisation, some of it was by catching up. I'm going to go back a bit before that key moment in 2007, 2008, when Iron Man was being put together and released. Marvel as an entity had been going since the 1930s. I think virtually as long as the DC comics were going, more or less. And yet, despite all the heroes they developed, they very rarely managed to get any success or juice out of them. I mean, DC did fairly well with Superman and with Batman, but Marvel had a sort of a strange sort of reversion of a Captain America. But they never really got their act together about this. Do you have any theories about what happened between, as it were, the Marvels of comics and the Marvel of the early 2000s that suddenly took them from, well, we've got some really interesting stories, but we're not quite sure what to do with them, into a phenomenon that started raking in billions of dollars for their movies? Do you have any thoughts about what happened there?
I can see Dave is about to answer something. I'm just going to give a small factual point before he does, which is, although Marvel had been around since the 1930s under different names, their superheroes came in like the 1960s.
Right, okay.
Fantastic Four and so on. So DC had a running start on like really like iconic heroes. And Dave, do you want to continue with the story?
Yeah, it's sort of about how to make the best money off of it. Like, I would say that what something like Chris Claremont did with the X-Men, what Frank Miller did with Daredevil, these are all important steps that are taken in the 80s about making the transition from comic books for quote unquote kids, or like the Stan Lee thing where it's like, hey kids, everyone's join the Mighty Marvel Marching Society, everyone's gonna hang out in New York, and like we have a bullpen, and like everybody's gonna come in and be friends, which was a kind of a facade into how Marvel was actually running. But it curated these fans to sort of be like a Make Mine Marvel group of kids. It had to grow up in the 1980s like all of comics did with storytelling. So you have a lot of great steps forward with the properties. But in terms of like the business of selling the comics, like after they had the one of the still the greatest selling comic of all time in X-Men #1 in the early 90s, they really drove that sort of collector's bubble into the ground, and eventually went bankrupt for something that had to do with the comics, but also what did with Ron Perlman, who owned Marvel Comics at the time, and, you know, invested in Fleer trading cards the year of the baseball strike. Just not a businessman of the moment, as much of this sort of like idea that he could own it and own potential rather than having to sort of shepherd things along. So it was really odd for me because that's when I got into comics. Like, one of my seminal arcs was the Spider-Man Clone Saga, which took 2 years, and everybody who's a Spider-Man fan thinks that was like really bad. And I was like, no, that was my mother's milk in terms of reading comics. So I got ingested into this thing where it's like big crossovers that would take years over multiple lines, and that's what led me to like buying lots of comic books. That didn't necessarily work out for Marvel in general, and through some bad business dealings, they went bankrupt in 1998, and I'm sorry, 1996, and when they came out of it in 1998, it was Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad of Toy Biz who were actually going to be the people controlling Marvel. So what started off as like a toy company absorbed Marvel, and those guys are very profit forward. They are very IP forward. So they are more interested in telling stories specifically to make toys and spin-offs and stuff like that. So you had Avi Arad, and we tell a little bit of the story in the book, who is very instrumental in getting the X-Men movie out. And the X-Men movie has a producer over at 20th Century Fox named Lauren Schuler Donner. And Lauren Schuler Donner, fantastic producer, has an assistant
Kevin
she's
Feige.
that she's going to send to X-Men every day. And that's how we get Kevin Feige entering the mold. But yeah, the difference sort of between the two is Ron Perlman was a businessman who had a lot of business ideas, sort of let Marvel Comics do what it wanted. And once it sort of got united under the Toy Biz Bros, they were like, what they had seen from something like X-Men, the animated series, is like the comics can feed the understanding of the IP, so people buy toys, so people buy t-shirts, and ultimately they thought of movies as another way to get people either into the comics, the toys, and the t-shirts. They thought that was like a point of entry for them. And I think without them doing that work, we don't get X-Men 2000, we don't get Spider-Man in 2002, we don't get sort of like the kickstart of this being a type of movie that you could see. So I give them all the credit to that, but they still didn't have the idea that all these things needed to connect. They saw movies as a valuable way to get people into the comics
and to buy toys.
Absolutely.
And this is really sort of where I think the thing becomes really interesting, because this young producer comes along. He's associated with one of the great producers in Hollywood, Lauren Schuler Donner. Kevin Feige comes along. He's clearly a geek himself. He loves the stories themselves. What is it? And he's spotted by Avi Arad, who's the sort of big IP guru of the sort of toy business thing, and whose name still appears across numerous Marvel credits. What is it about the chemistry of Kevin Feige arriving that changes the business model? Or am I overemphasizing? Did it really change the business model, or did he try something and blow me it worked? What was it that you think happened?
He was in the right place, but I think what Kevin Feige brought to the table that was not there previously, and sort of these, X-Men and Spider-Man movies would have happened even without him. So like there was a lot of momentum going this direction. But the secret sauce is that although he was a geek, he was a movie geek. He grew up on blockbusters. He loved Back to the Future. He loved Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he was new to comics. So he's coming at it both from the perspective of somebody who had always been like making movies in his head and making sequels in his head, but didn't know the mythology. And then when he gets into he does his homework because he's incredibly diligent and thorough. And so he'll do things like go on vacations where he just sort of sits there with a stack of comic books, and all he does is like read in the shade. And he turns himself into a comics geek and finds almost in all cases like, sort of like people in Hollywood, sort of like they don't take these characters seriously, but this has been an amazing like development lab of ideas. You've had hundreds of people making comic books every single month. If you have a question about the character or a problem with the character, the answer is there. And so that half in, half out perspective, I think, is what really animates the MCU once it gets started.
What do you think? Do you have anything to add on Kevin Feige's secret sauce, Dave?
Yeah, I think he was as surprised by the fact that there was going to be a Marvel Studios as anybody else, because like as Gavin outlined, he was a sequel person, and up to that point, up until the David Maisel deal, which is really sort of the tipping point into Marvel Studios proper. Marvel's just making movies. They're advisors on movies. Avi Arad picks out Kevin Feige and he's like, you're going to be my dude on set. And so I think Kevin Feige would have attempted to try to make the best movie that he could being an advisor. And so we have a quote in our book that like he's just disappointed he didn't have as much control over things like the Ben Affleck Daredevil or some of the Fantastic Four movies, which, some of them did better than others. But he was like, if he felt like he had good ideas there that he wasn't able to execute, he hit some sort of ceiling. So I think the secret sauce that Kevin Feige has is not only sort of like knowing what he's doing his research, being a movie guy, but them realizing they were going to put him in charge. And like now, once the buck stops with Kevin Feige or Avi Arad or David Maisel, once it's down to those three people, and it's not Kevin Feige's talking to a studio head he doesn't necessarily know at either Sony or Fox, I think that's part of the secret sauce. Is I only know it's part of the secret sauce because the more you diversify, the more the person at the top of the pyramid isn't Kevin Feige, the shakier the product has gotten. And that's sort of what we've seen in these past couple of years is Kevin Feige stretched thin. So he's trying to install other executives beneath him, but none of them have recaptured that secret sauce. He is sort of a singular executive in that it's hard to tell what he does, but it's definitely him doing it.
Sorry, Gavin, yeah?
No, I was enjoying Dave's turn of phrase. I will say the other thing he brought to the table was Hugh Jackman's hair as Wolverine. That like on the set of X-Men, he's saying, bigger, like make it more like the comics.
Yeah, and he's finally doing it. We'll finally see it. And the intended Kevin Feige hair this summer in theaters.
In the Wolverine and yeah.
Cool.
Of course, one of the things that gave Kevin Feige the particular authority to do everything you've just described, both of you, is this pivotal decision you mentioned to go from being effectively a manipulator or leverager of IP, turning up and advising Fox on a movie they wanted to make or Sony on a movie they wanted to make, into becoming a studio. What was the thinking there, the David Maisel decision to go to the banks and say, underpin our own effective production? What do you think the change was there? Or was it just, that isn't working, let's try something else?
It's not that it wasn't working, it was that they were leaving a huge amount of money on the table. That David Maisel, was just like a really good, smart Hollywood contract guy, and he looked at it and said, if Spider-Man's grossing $500 million, you're getting just like a small percentage of that. Put yourself in a position to be making these movies rather than just like licensing them all out. Now, and the fact that he came in an interesting moment where they had licensed out almost, basically all of the A-list properties.
Yeah.
And we can still do this with this box scraps that, we have like Thor left over, even if nobody thinks it's a good movie character. Captain America, like everyone thinks is sort of like corny, but sure, if we do it and we do it with verve, it's going to work. And then the reason it's able to get off the ground is they convinces like Perlmutter, who owns Marvel at that point, you are not making as much money as you want to be, and there was nothing like Perlmutter like better than making more money.
Right. So they decided to become a studio. They decided to become a studio because it basically would deliver them greater returns, and presumably on a more esoteric level, though this necessarily what Perlmutter was interested in, greater creative control. And they hit on, as their totem figure for this, Iron Man. Now, I grew up in Marvel Comics, and I was I always thought Marvel was about Spider-Man, and I thought it was about the Fantastic Four, and it was about the X-Men. I sort of knew about Iron Man. I had a memory of a big golden suit, and so on. But that decision to, as it were, take a property who was slightly off-center and put him center stage was an interesting one. Any thoughts about what the process was there? Because we look back on it, and we look back on Robert Downey Jr. and think there's no way we could conceive of Marvel without wisecracking actor, golden red suit, flying through the air. Yet at the time, he was not at the center of the Marvel Universe, was he? What was the thinking there, do you think?
I believe the thinking was, according to Ike Perlmutter's lawyer, John Turretson, they sat a whole bunch of kids down and gave them a whole bunch of Marvel toys to play with. And they're like, which one would you want to see in a movie? And they were like, the robot that flies and has lasers that he shoots out of his hands. They didn't know Iron Man either. And to a certain extent, that is part of the Marvel magic. Like once they make Iron Man, they start applying what they see as like the Iron Man formula to the other properties. But that's like, it doesn't have to be the comics. They're not adapting Demon in a Bottle. What they are doing is they're taking just the idea that they own, whether it be a costume, whether it be a premise, and allowing filmmakers to sort of spin it out. So Jon Favreau, I think, first met with Marvel to do a sort of man at a time Captain America comedy movie. He was the elf guy. That was the thing that got him a meeting with Kevin Feige, because Kevin Feige loved Elf. And then at that point, he had just done Zathura, which is sort of like space Jumanji, and did that with a producer, Louis D'Esposito, who's going to come and join Marvel full time after Iron Man. But Jon Favreau's like, I'm kind of getting into sci-fi, kind of getting into some more family entertainment, and maybe doesn't want to do the elf/swingers version of Captain America. So they're like, well, we want to like lead with Iron Man. And it's Jon Favreau who's like, how can I, he does a lot of the work of how can I sell this to the general audiences. So he's somebody that's like, this has to be plausible. This has to be based in the real world. We have to update Iron Man or Tony Stark's Vietnam backstory up to Desert Storm-ish area. But not too specific, because again, you know, it's going to be a dumb superhero movie, so it needs to be plausible, but not too plausible. And he's the one who sort of puts his butt on the line when people are doubting hiring Robert Downey Jr. and saying like, no, this is the dude, watch this, you know, audition again. And once it becomes Robert Downey Jr. and Jon Favreau, it sort of becomes them versus the world in terms of making this movie. And they break the script apart every day and they sort of like improvise it. And it develops this idea for Marvel that like best idea wins. And that is what allows this sort of like alchemy that happens. I believe if I were to give credit to people specifically, it would be Jon Favreau, Robert Downey Jr., and Dan Leventhal, the editor on Iron Man, who's cutting it as they're shooting it to sort of figure out what the tone balance needs to be. And what they land on is something like Iron Man that could go between very fun action scenes and just straight up comedy, depending on what Robert Downey Jr.'s serving. And while they're doing that simultaneously, they're trying the same thing with the Incredible Hulk, but Edward Norton is like a different beast when it comes to a star running the production. So when they come out with these two movies and they're like, Iron Man worked, Incredible Hulk kind of didn't, what if every movie we did is sort of like Iron Man? And that works for them to a certain degree until you start realizing that not every director is Jon Favreau and not every star is Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah, I would point out like absolutely what Dave said, and the fact that like Robert Downey Jr.'s DNA is all over the rest of the MCU as a result. That, you know, like if you look at the Iron Man comics, Tony Stark is not a particularly snarky guy. He's not really funny. He's not a wisecracker. But you put somebody like Downey in and he brings his own personality to the table, and there's this knowingness and there's this sarcasm and there's this sort of like everyone is in on the joke of the project, and that really just sort of determines like the tone of the rest of the MCU that comes after it.
Okay, so we've arrived at the point now where the first movie has been launched. It's starting to identify a tone and also a style of working. Best idea wins. I'll return to that in a moment when we talk about the way the studio is run. We're starting to get a few questions from our audience, and I just want to say in advance, there's a couple of questions here which we will get to later, so please be patient because they will fit into a sort of narrative. But we might as well do it for a light one now, guys. What's your favourite Marvel film and why? I know you're supposed to throw our chronological sequence, but I think it'll be a lighter moment before we get back into the nitty-gritty of running a studio. Gavin, what's yours? Favourite Marvel film and why?
Mine is you know, you could catch me on a different day and I'd say something else, but the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, which was this like moment of just like bizarre invention that, you know, I was a big comics fan and I didn't know these characters, and it's like, well, I'm just going to trust Marvel and go in. And the fact that it was this antic, crazy movie with like a talking raccoon and that, you know, but it was still hugely entertaining and had heart. And that was the moment where it became clear, oh, Marvel can get away with anything it wants to. And like, I'm just going to sign up and be there for it.
So Guardians of the Galaxy 1, 2, and 3, or just number 1?
Really just number 1 for me. You know, like, I mean, there's moments in 2 and 3, but 1 is the one I love.
Dave?
Avengers Infinity War, because I remember going to my press screening for that and it ending and me just being like, Avengers lose. Thanos is the hero of this movie. Like what what a thing. And then I was like, I took like, it took me a couple of hours to sort of process it and be like, this is what everybody's going to go through when they see this movie. But then also realizing, like, of course, those people aren't dead for forever. But just like the idea that they were building to like this Thanos guy, and he didn't really get out of his chair for his first couple times we were seeing him. And then this movie starts and he's just like going toe to toe with the Hulk and beating him. And I'm like, okay, great. And it becomes this threat. And so every time people are like, what this new Marvel is missing is like a big threat, I'm like, Thanos was not a big threat until Avengers Infinity War. He was a guy in a chair until he made the Avengers lose. And I think just that's a great, why not do Empire Strikes Back like ending where your heroes have lost, knowing that you're going to have more Avengers movies. I'm surprised they didn't deploy that tactic earlier, but saving it to Infinity War and having it be this massive loss, I just appreciate it so much as a film that works on its own, but just in the architecture of the entire arc is amazing.
And for what it's worth, because the question did say all the speakers, I'll say briefly, for me, it was Endgame. Partly because Infinity Wars was so breathtaking, and Endgame managed to solve it with the smallest number of tricks possible. But the final moment when they gather on the battlefield outside the ruined headquarters is one of the great cinematic moments. It gives me absolute chills when all the portals open up. So I'm as much a geek as anyone else. So let's just go back to the... Sorry, Gavin.
I was going to say that, like, one of the great Marvel strengths is their willingness to wait years and years to do something that nobody in any movie said Avengers Assemble until that moment.
Yeah.
Sort of like they were always very big on playing the long game that way.
And wasn't it wonderful how quietly he said it?
Yes.
Just brilliant. Let's just go back to, we've got to the point where, Iron Man is now there. There's a tone, there's a mode. We're now starting to see the formation of something more than just Kevin Feige spotting the potential within property, convincing the powers that be they can make more money. We're getting into something else. We're now getting into something which is becoming a studio and so on. And key to that is not just Kevin Feige himself and the talent who is starting to assemble, but also critically some backroom people. Tell us a little bit more about this stage, about the key figures, Luis Esposito and Victoria Alonso. Why were they so important?
Well, Victoria Alonso was in charge of like basically all post-production. And so it was this unified thing of like, she came in and she was working on Iron. Well, Luis Esposito comes first, that he, sort of like is in as like a major producer who's going to like wrangle a lot of things at Marvel. Victoria Alonso takes charge of post-production, so it's like editing, and it's very importantly visual effects, and sort of like music and other post-production questions. And so what you have is like Marvel is building up something more like the old Hollywood studios, where they like a lot of things are happening in-house. That sort of like whereas a modern like sort of like Warner Brothers, they've got like a staff of executives, but a lot of what they do is they hire directors and producers who are doing their own productions. And here at Marvel, it's like we're just going to have people who, if they're doing concept art for the movie, they're going to like work on Captain America for a while, and then as soon as that's done, we're going to keep them on staff, and they're going to roll right on to Thor. So you have an unusual situation where you have it has both strengths and drawbacks. That it can make everything have sort of like a certain consistency of sort of like tone, and it all fits together. On the downside, there's a certain amount of consistency. There's like less room for people to like go off in an exciting like new jagged trajectory.
Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I would. I think Gavin outlined it pretty good, where it's like Kevin Feige is the one who's ultimately going to be thinking about concepts and be the person that basically can introduce what is possible and what isn't possible to the pre-production teams, and be able to run that. Victoria Alonso takes things into post-production. So after Lou and Kevin Feige are kind of done with it, it goes and becomes her purview, and then she becomes the sort of top of the ladder. And Lou, I would say he's the guy that sort of like he has been making movies long before either of these two have been like the top of the thing. So I always used to say, like, if you really want to be in a Marvel movie, you got to get his phone number, because he's the one who's going to hash out your contract. He's the one who's going to get your general. He's a fantastic dude and very nice, but he's sort of the hammer of the situation. Where it's like, if Kevin says, yeah, okay, and Victoria can't deal with it yet because it's not in post-production, Lou's gonna have to be the one that sort of kills your dream. But that doesn't really happen at the beginning. At the beginning, it's all three of them basically being like, how can we make these three movies that need to lead to the Avengers, and make it in a way where they're all in production at the same time, but they're all going to be released sort of in a staggering way. It needs all three of them to be focused on different points in order for that to finally culminate. So like Kevin, especially with the idea that best idea wins, Kevin would be like, absolutely find that best idea. It'd be up to Lou or Victoria to tell you, well, you got to find those ideas within the next 3 days because this deadline's coming up, or we're losing this person to contract. And so they were the problem solvers underneath that. It would be, at least for the first two phases, while they still have to report to somebody.
And of course, one of the things that the Iron Man film demonstrated was this ability they have to, as it were, go in clearly with scripts and very clearly conceived ideas, but then suddenly they throw it up in the air and play around with it and work out the best endings. So there was this, one gets the impression that this is a studio which is, if you like, in constant motion. And one way it's incredibly relentless. It's producing film after film after film. In your book, you describe the various offices they work in with these huge teams of concept artists working up costumes and ideas and special effects. But on the other side, you've got them saying that idea isn't working, let's do something else and put something else together. So what was your impression about the way in which the Marvel Studio system, at least in those early days, worked? You've described, best ideas wins. You've described a certain amount of discipline, but I also get the impression it was quite freewheeling as well. How would you describe it?
I think there's a lot of ways that with that first phase, especially, you have Jon Favreau coming back for Iron Man 2, you have Kenneth Branagh on Thor, and you have Joe Johnston on Captain America. They were like, let the directors do the thing that they do best, and then we will fill in the Marvel around them. So like Kenneth Branagh didn't really know that much about Thor, but he did know this sort of high royal almost drama capabilities. So he is big in casting. He's big at explaining to people like Natalie Portman why this isn't dumb. Like that's sort of his magic sauce. Joe Johnston not only did like The Rocketeer and is like a big special effects guy way back with ILM, but he also appreciates design. We have a story in our book where like the executives would come to the thing and the creative professionals had built him sort of a secret room on set where he could go and just sort of sketch out things that he wanted to do, like Red Skull's car or something. He's like, what if the things, and he would sketch that out himself because that's his background. But sort of like when you see the transition from that after Joss Whedon picks up the Avengers, the sort of phase 2 directors are ones that they could sort of push around a little bit more, because then they're a little bit more concerned about how the story is interlinking. For that first phase, it's definitely best idea wins, but a lot of times you're going to default to the director because they hired the director being like, we know what we want this to feel like. We don't know what it is. Like, we'll tell you what your MacGuffins are. We'll, Joe Johnston, don't worry about what the cosmic cube is. We'll do that. What we need you to do is period Nazis that aren't really Nazis, because we can't sell Nazi toys. We have to sell Hydra toys. So like, that's the sort of concern. They'll come in with like a piece that you need to leave open for somebody else, or an idea that they want your movie to be about. But Marvel wasn't like strong arming people into one storyline in that first phase. Phase 2, it's all, how do we get to Age of Ultron and, pick up all of these pieces. And it sort of becomes a little bit more ragged in terms of, can these directors have their own individual movies? Where I think like phase 1, like Thor is more of a Kenneth Branagh movie than, Thor: The Dark World is anybody's movie, really. So I think that's sort of the change that they learn is at the first phase, they're really depending on the director to sort of come in. And the second phase takes a much more TV approach where the director is coming into the project and has to sort of execute that.
And the really illustrative example, I mean, this is one of my favorite chapters in the book, is what happened to Edgar Wright with Ant-Man. He almost made one of the, like, he had this idea for the movie, they had a treatment, and basically, sort of like it almost was one of the first Marvel movies. And then for a variety of reasons, including sort of health scares and him having other projects, it just kept getting pushed off year after year after year. And so by the time, sort of like both he and Marvel like come into alignment like many years later, they're no longer building the sandbox. Where if it had been, say, movie number 3, Marvel would have pretty much let him do whatever he wanted. But when it's movie number 13 or 15, instead they're like, oh, well, you've got to, sort of establish continuity with this character, and you've got to do this, and like that. And he really chafes at like the limitations that have come in the intervening years. It's like, oh, I wanted to do my movie. Why don't you want to do it anymore? So.
And by that time, they needed a jobbing director who would deliver what they wanted, rather than an auteur like Edgar Wright.
Yeah.
Can we just talk about this relationship with directors? Because you made a very clear point there, Dave, that phase 1, freewheeling, Branagh does Thor, Marvel is Shakespeare, that sort of stuff. By the time we get into phase 2 and beyond, we're getting into a far more constrained environment, which culminates obviously in the Russo brothers, who clearly do, in a very effective and deliberate way, what they're told, in a sense, or at least they're the line. But there are these complex relationships along there, because you've had the talk about Edgar Wright. Let's talk a bit, because it's inescapable, about the relationship with Joss Whedon. Because here's another one of the great sort of mega storytellers in Hollywood. But it turned out to be a rather complex. I mean, it gave them the Avengers in one sense, but then it didn't give them everything they wanted after that. Describe the relationship between Whedon and Marvel. A story in itself, I suspect.
Yeah. Gavin, you want to try to do this concisely?
So, I mean, Joss Whedon was at an interesting moment where he was, sort of like a revered cult figure from Buffy, but, sort of like, if you were in that world, he seemed huge, but he in fact had never, sort of like it was more of a critical success than it was, like a big box office thing. And he was really not sure where he was going with his life. And then, he sort of gets the Avengers job, and like it turns out to play exactly into all of his strengths. That, sort of he's good at writing, sort of like the quips like on the fly for Robert Downey Jr. He's written so many TV shows with like gangs of misfits banding together that he's really good at establishing this with the Avengers. He had written Marvel comic books. He had grown up on these characters, and he just sort of like, he was not a great visual, sort of like the storyteller, but he was like a great script writer, and there was enough people around him that like they could add like sort of like the visual bang that like the Avengers needed, even if like that meant he and the Marvel were loggerheads at times. So then you get into a situation where like they wanted him to be basically like sort of like the czar of storytelling. Like they're like, what if we ran every script through Joss Whedon? And what if we just sort of like let him sort of like put his thumbprints all over everything? And it came to a head with the second Avengers movie, where I think it boils down to he burned out, that there was just like so much of it, and he reached a point where he just sort of like he chafed at the constraints that were building up as he was helping establish the Marvel universe. That like even in the short couple of years between Avengers 1 and Avengers 2, that it just got more and more notes, and when he wanted to sort of like the exercise even just like sort of like minor directorial prerogatives of like, what if we had like an aside in this scene, or what if we had like sort of a quiet moment at the farmhouse, sort of like their executives, in fairness, maybe not all in LA, like some of this is like the toy people in New York, but nevertheless, I think he just like hit a wall of like what it was possible for like one person to give to the Marvel machine.
Mm-hmm. So basically, well, we're going to get into this idea of the creative committee in a moment, but I want to, this idea of the people in New York who are sort of, presiding over what should or should not happen. But I wonder, I'll come back to the audience questions, and these are sort of linked in a way. And again, maybe it blows our chronology a bit, but hey, Marvel itself was always mucking around with its chronology. One of the questioners asked whether that you think anything will ever come close to this sort of this mega interconnected story universe. Anything will ever come close to that again in Hollywood? And what's sort of connected to that, because Marvel have done this so successfully, is the question here: what does the panel think about how Marvel has changed Hollywood now that every studio seems to be trying to create a universe of its own? Clearly Warner's with the DCU. So they're sort of linked. So I suppose the question is, just at this whole halfway house through our conversation, how substantial an influence has Marvel been, as it were? And how much has it changed Hollywood as a consequence, you think?
I mean, first of all, I don't think it's possible to happen again. I think this is a set of circumstances that allowed them to, by the time we hit 2019, they're just churning out billion-dollar movie after billion-dollar movie. A lot of it's sort of like the narrowing of what's being offered in theaters, and a lot of it is sort of when these other companies try to boot up their cinematic universes, like even with Sony, who has a Marvel property, when they do Amazing Spider-Man 2, and they're like, and we're going to lead in the Sinister Six, and they just fall on their face kind of doing it. That sort of gave the idea that Marvel was being like super successful with it. And I think that begat a whole bunch of things where Gavin was sort of talking about right at the beginning, the capable of coming to a conclusion. So like, I don't think we have James Bond No Time to Die if Endgame doesn't succeed, where it's just like, what if we did an end to this never ending thing? Would that like benefit? So I think Marvel has changed the idea of what you could do with IP storytelling, both for good and for bad. I think a way that you could sort of see it turning out bad is what Universal keeps trying to do with its monsters, where it's like, well, what if this is our interconnected universe, and what if this is our interconnected universe? And then you have something like the Invisible Man, the newest Invisible Man, where it's like, we're just going to tell a story on its own, and that ends up being like the good one. So I think there's a misunderstanding about what an interconnected universe can necessarily do. I do think Marvel is somewhat responsible for the narrowing into everything needs to be IP. Even something like Fall Guy, which isn't doing that well based off of a TV show, or just sort of this idea where it's like, if it isn't based off something, even if it's based off something that doesn't seem like it's popular, like Fall Guy, like Iron Man in 2008, if it's not based off something, people won't show up. Which is sort of like a misnomer, because like Marvel was working with the tools that it had. But I do think that's the lesson that Hollywood has taken, is like everything should be an interconnected universe. And I think that's very specific. Like, it comes back to what Stan Lee was doing for comics in the 60s. That's why it works for Marvel. It's not necessarily a formula that is for everybody. And I don't know what has to happen for Hollywood to like do that. Why is Chris Pratt every animated character from my childhood now? Like, I think that's partially Marvel's fault. Gavin, do you have another perspective on it?
I mean, I will say not a radically different perspective, but as much as I love many of the Marvel movies, it's just sort of like accelerated something that was already happening, which was just like the blockbusterization of Hollywood. And look at sort of Disney, where they've recently said, why should we bother making anything that's not a Star Wars movie or a Marvel movie or a Pixar movie? If it's not one of those three things, there's really no point for us. And so sort of like, I have no problem with Marvel movies being as big as they are, but it's a sad situation when it feels like sort of the only types of movies that these studios are interested in making are like like these, just sort of like, if it can't be a dominant blockbuster movie, they have no time for it.
Either $30 million or $200 million. There's nothing in between, it is said.
Right, exactly.
Let's just get back into our own chronology for a little bit. we started talking about, Joss Whedon starting to chafe against the limits that were starting to come into the Marvel system. 2009, Marvel is bought out by Disney in one of the biggest deals in movie history. So suddenly, a comparatively self-contained outfit now becomes part of, frankly, the most famous studio in the world, with an ethos all of its own. And at the same time, the other side of it, there's Marvel itself with its own history, based in a toy company, Ike Perlmutter's Toy Biz and so on, so you've got Disney, movies, innovation, family entertainment, theme parks, yes. And then you've got toys and IP leverage, both of them, of course, IP specialists. Suddenly, this valuable storytelling property is now, caught between two completely different ethoses? Would that be fair to say?
I don't think that's quite right.
Okay.
Disney is trying to round out, sort of like make sure it's got like all the sectors of entertainment. And they didn't have anything really that appealed to young men. They had like plenty of movies for kids. They had, stuff that appealed to women. But they're like, okay, if we do this, sort of other than like sports coverage, we didn't have this before. What you do have is, Disney is mostly happy to leave Marvel alone, perhaps to a fault, because the problem that you get into is what you mentioned before, the creative committee in New York, that, when Marvel Studios starts up, Ike Perlmutter and his New York executives are just like, oh, you guys go do your thing, maybe we'll sell some more toys. But the more it becomes the center of the company, the more they want to put their thumbprints on it because it looks like fun, and the more they want to control it. And so the more they're sort of like offering, sort of like notes, which are in some cases wrongheaded, in some cases really hidebound. And so you have Kevin Feige and the people in LA fighting very hard and very unsuccessfully for a long time to have a movie starring a female solo character. It's years and years before you have Black Widow. They have to fight incredibly hard to get Black Panther made because, sort of like the toy making conventional wisdom is that, sort of like little kids are not going to buy, sort of like toys that are women or toys that are, like African-American characters, or Black Panther is actually just African. So it actually takes the intercession of Disney to like say, like Perlmutter, let Kevin Feige and your people in Hollywood cook, sort of like they're going to report directly to us now because you're actually hindering the process, not helping it.
It does become something of a showdown, doesn't it? Because you've got Kevin Feige caught in the middle, in a sense. You've got the creative committee in New York with their particular monetized version of Marvel. Yeah. And you've got not only Disney, you've got Bob Iger, who at the time is probably the most powerful person in Hollywood, give or take. And of course, that does come to a form of showdown, doesn't it? Dave, can you take us through broadly how that sort of, inverted commas, resolved itself?
Yeah, my understanding, and this is Bob Iger's telling of it, which is Kevin Feige doesn't talk about this, but someone alerted him that they were being held back over at Marvel Studios and that they had all these great ideas. They've been developing things like Black Panther. They've been wanting to introduce Captain Marvel. They had even shot plates for Avengers Age of Ultron for Captain Marvel that ended up being used for the Scarlet Witch because they were like, let's get there. But the creative committee, which was the Marvel Entertainment people, kept telling him that they didn't want to do it. And it eventually got to the point where they're developing Captain America Civil War with the Russo brothers. And the note from the creative committee, the East Coast people, is nobody wants to see the Avengers fight each other. And the Russo brothers and Marcus and McFeely, the writers, are pulling their hair out. So like, that's what everybody wants to see. Like, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what this movie is. So the Russo brothers are like, it's this or we walk. And that is what causes somebody, we don't know who, to talk directly to Bob Iger. Who has that power? You could narrow that down yourself, I think. And Bob Iger has to call Ike Perlmutter, and it's like, I know I said that I was going to take the, Pixar route that I promised Steve Jobs, which is don't get involved, let them do their own thing. I know I was going to say that, but you guys need to stop telling Marvel Studios they can't do things. I think we've seen that they know what they're doing. Like, why don't you, as Gavin put it, let them cook? And that is where sort of Ike Perlmutter and the creative committee ultimately lose to Kevin Feige and the Marvel Studios. And that's why when Phase 3 is announced, they have this event at the El Capitan Theater in California, and it is available on YouTube. And I think watching it after reading our book is a fantastic exercise, because it's the only panel really that Kevin Feige's like, I'm going to host this myself. And he just lays out all of Phase 3 and like, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. What if we have like Captain America and Steve Rogers fight each other? Let's bring out Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. And it's this moment where Age of Ultron's in the edit, and there's some you could see a very tired Joss Whedon sort of sitting there like this the whole time. And Kevin Feige's like, but subtext, we're free of the creative committee, so look at what I'm going to give to you. And it's really this triumphant moment, because behind the scenes, he's off the leash, and he's like, let me show people how I'm going to get people to Infinity War. He's off the leash. He knows the Russo brothers are going to jump from Civil War to the Avengers movies. The Russos have already given that idea, because Joss Whedon's already said, I'm tired, please don't make me. So like, that is the most energetic and excited I've ever seen Kevin Feige at a business presentation, because he's like, finally I get to do it. And then for the most part, with the exception of the Inhumans, managed to execute that plan that he had that day in California.
Was the creative committee sort of replaced later, though? Because you talk later in the book about the sort of creative parliament, which, if you like, becomes a later phase of, if you like, creative control. Is there a distinction between what was happening with the East Coast Creative Committee and the subsequent, frankly, Kevin Feige-led studio that creates a creative parliament? Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's a big difference. I mean, one, the creative committee was imposed from the outside, like, and originally just to sort of like, let's control scheduling so that we can make sure that the movies come out at the same time as the toys come out, which was always like Ike Perlmutter's great fear of like, oh, if you move up the movie by 3 months, we don't have toys in stores yet. Gradually tried to just like exert more and more control over it. The Marvel Parliament happens basically because Kevin Feige's only one man. And, sort of like later on, sort of like, and again, this is Iger, who, sort of gives with one hand and takes away with another, when there is the imperative with Disney Plus to just like dramatically expand production, and it's not enough to do 3 movies a year. What if we also do 5 television series a year? And so Kevin Feige cannot just possibly, sort of like oversee all of that with the same attention. So that, sort of like bringing in a whole bunch of junior producers and making sure that there is like something like a group mind meld, so that you can keep everyone together, even as they go off and supervise individual television shows.
So now entering the sort of phase in the discussion, which, if you like, is intimating some of the questions I'm being asked about the sort of, as it were, starting to Marvel proliferating beyond movies. I'd just like to talk a bit about its complex relationship with television, which probably has gone into 2 phases. There was an early phase where there was Marvel Television, which produced things like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the stuff for Netflix. And then there's a subsequent one, which has produced WandaVision and Loki. Let's talk about the first one first, because we've had a question about the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which, by the way, was a series I quite liked, especially when Agent Coulson comes out of the shadows and said, oh, the lighting's not very good back there. Sort of But what was that early relationship? We're starting to get into this idea of not just an interconnected universe, but interconnected media now. What was that early relationship with television like? I understand it was quite rocky. Is that right?
Yeah, it was before. So there's still a creative committee in play, and they want to launch a television series, and they have some good ideas for a TV series, but ultimately that is going to be under Jeff Loeb as a head creative and not Kevin Feige, which, like, Jeff Loeb has done some fantastic things, so I see why they wanted to do it. They also had like Drew Goddard at the time was writing Bibles for them, or pre-production documents for what would eventually become the Netflix series. So they have all these interesting things in development. My understanding is the Avengers comes out and Joss sort of pitches Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and staffs it up with his family members. And Kevin Feige's only response that I think we've ever had recorded was like, that's fine, but we're gonna destroy Shield, so like go with God. But like Phil Coulson's dead. Undoing Phil Coulson's death at the time that he did it sort of undoes a key point of the Avengers, because that's why they assemble in the first Avengers. So I think Marvel Studios was always sort of the first season or two, they'll toss them some guest stars. Your Lady Sifs, your Samuel L. Jackson shows up for the first season finale of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And that starts getting less and less, because I think that Marvel Studios was always told to give something to Marvel Television, and Marvel Television, because it was being run like a traditional television show, had to eat plot in a way that Marvel Studios wasn't comfortable with. By the time like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is wrapping up, it's like they're doing space portals, the Darkhold has showed up, like all these different things that they're pulling, and they're not really coordinating with Marvel Studios. So there are certain things that are born out of Marvel Studios that become TV shows, like Agent Carter. That was Louis D'Esposito's sort of like baby, with Marcus and McFeely, who wrote the first Captain America. So that's a bit more canon. But the Netflix shows and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they were doing their own thing, and Marvel Studios couldn't really say like this did or did not happen. I think Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s big problem was they were so ambitious with the types of stories they wanted to do, like life model decoys and stuff like that, that they sort of got too big for the Marvel Studios britches. So it would be very hard to make it canonical again, the way they're sort of looping back to like the Netflix Daredevil series and sort of bringing those back in. Because the Netflix Daredevil series made some allusions to Avengers happening, but otherwise was very street level and kept its own thing.
Yeah.
So there was this idea that's like, we're going to be able to share canon back and forth with the television series and whatnot. But then it's really started off immediately on the wrong foot by being like, Agent Coulson's alive, and Marvel Studios didn't want that to be a thing. So right from the beginning, Marvel Television has some problems where it's not considered canon in Marvel Studios, and that's what leads to sort of the friction now, or the latter series, which maybe Gavin could speak to a little bit more, because that's definitely more involved with our book. Eventually Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige is given the reins over what is considered television, and really that's all they wanted. They wanted the control to be able to say what was and wasn't part of their universe.
And once they have the freedom to run with that, there's like hugely mixed results from the beginning. That sort of like something like WandaVision, I think is just like a triumph, pretty much top to bottom, where they sort of like have just like the very clever sort of like meta idea of like working through like different periods and like sitcoms, and it all essentially being in Wanda's head. And then you have something like the Falcon and Winter Soldier, where despite like some good chemistry between the leads, the whole thing just kind of zigzags around in like a not really satisfying fashion. And so the big thing that I think that you take away from this is that all of the people making TV are ultimately hamstrung by, they only have so much room to play with, and they are running into something that is more often a problem for Marvel visual effects artists, which is we may have to change everything at the last minute. And so in the case of visual effects, you end up with like, oh, well, sometimes it looks like just sort of digital spackle, and it's muddy and it's unpleasant and everyone involved is exhausted. The version of that of being a Marvel TV showrunner is you can't commit to an ending, because Marvel may tell you at the last minute, oh, you know what, we're actually going to go in this other direction because we need this character alive to set up a plot point in this upcoming Doctor Strange movie. And so what you get is people writing towards an ending that they don't know what it is, and so they like to give themselves a menu of options to choose from, which is not really a satisfying narrative structure. Like, okay, we picked an end to our adventure, but sort of like ideally you're actually setting it up in the first place.
So we're now in a phase, so we've had two phases of television. One of the points you made earlier, Gavin, is a very important one, I think, is the arrival of Disney Plus. Disney's need to populate and find content, new content, as well as a fantastic archive to drive the streaming wars is incredibly important. Some people have said, and this is reflected in some of the questions, that hunger was one of the contributors, in a sense at least, that more recently Marvel has, if you like, give the pun, lost the plot a little. So point one, Do you think there has come a point where Marvel, because maybe Kevin Feige is trying to do too much, maybe because there are so many pressures to produce more and more content because the market's changing, that some of the integrity and the trajectory and the dynamism of the early phases has been lost? What's your view on that as a general principle? Because it's widely talked about on the interweb, isn't it? All of this.
I think all of that is true. I'm also just going to point out, and like there's many factors. So I know I'm leaving about like 6 other things on the table for Dave here. But what is that, sort of like the flip side of having a 20 movie sequence that comes to a really satisfying conclusion is it's very hard to figure out the next thing. Sort of it feels like an end to a story. And then, sort of how do you make an organic thing that's going to push through that? And even if they had not been sort of like stretched thin, and even if they had not introduced all these problems, and even if sort of like China had not stopped showing Marvel's movies, I think they still would have had a crisis around at the same time, although maybe not as pronounced of one.
Yeah, I think they're a victim of their own success in a couple different ways. One is they taught us that every installment matters. And then they did that through Endgame. And then they're like, multiverse saga. Some of these might not matter, which I think is a great way to, put story first, which ultimately I think was their intention at some point, was like, let's allow stories to end. Because like Gavin was saying, a lot of the Disney Plus shows, they'd be like, yeah, Wanda's going to go on to Multiverse of Madness. And then because of like the pandemic, all of a sudden Multiverse of Madness has to get rescheduled and you've already shot WandaVision. And how do you Doctor Strange is supposed to show up in the WandaVision finale and they had to just kind of roll up all the references to Doctor Strange out. So there was all these changing things. And so they thought, what if we could experiment a little bit more and let some movies exist just on their own? Your Eternals, your Shang-Chi, your She-Hulks even, your What Ifs. What if we play in this multiverse where maybe things aren't as connected as we thought? And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect with the audience who was taught between 2008 and 2019 that everything was important. So Marvel now, I think, is trying to teach us as an audience to be more accepting of a more diverse slate of plots. But we won't really know how successful that is until they try to bring it all together again. And we see sort of what pieces we are left with. So we might be in a sallow portion of the Marvel arc, but I don't think it's quite dead yet. It's more like how we felt when phase 2 was actually happening, where we're like, where is this going? Thanos was at the end of Avengers movie, and now we're doing what? Dark Elves with Thor? We've been in this period with Marvel before. I just don't think we can call it a success or a failure until we see how they wrap it up, which is the capitalism trick, really, because I'm going to stay a Disney Plus subscriber. I'm going to see Deadpool and Wolverine, even though I might not have liked some of the movies they put out since.
But of course, I mean, is there a difference between the sort of Thor Dark World reaction, a bit of a misfire, and the massive misfires, which are things like, forgive me, Chloe Zhao for this, the Eternals, and obviously what was the one that set on the moon, which had the cardboard sets out of Star Trek? What was that called?
Oh, that's the Inhumans. Yeah.
The Inhumans. I mean, in this latter phase, we've had spectacular misfires, not just sort of didn't work. Do you think there is a feeling from the audience that, okay, we'll embrace the stories can go anywhere and it can be relative and they can do all sorts of different things, and when they're really good, there'll be WandaVision, but please don't give us things which misfire so badly? Is that part of the problem, do you think?
We wrote an extra chapter actually for the paperback version of MCU coming out later this year. And the biggest takeaway for me was that, sure, there's always been some misfires along the way, but Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, the third Ant-Man, was the first time when Marvel was surprised by a failure. Other times when they've had, sort of problematic movies, well, we'll make the best of it as we can and then we'll move on. In that case, they're like, you know what? We had some problems, but we nailed it. And then when it came out and the audiences said, in fact, you did not nail it, they really had a crisis and realized that a lot of what they've been doing, had really finally caught up with them. And that's why you see, right now, and just in the past year, this kind of like sweaty, frantic attempt to like remake everything on the fly. And so you have something like, the Marvels, which also did not do well, but you could tell they very, very aggressively re-edited it at the last minute to make it just short. It's a like 90-minute movie or 92-minute movie, maybe. And so there's this sense that Marvel knows they've got a problem, and like really the best possible thing they have going for them right now is they only have one movie coming out this year, which is the aforementioned Deadpool and Wolverine. And sort of it gives them a chance to take a step back and say like, okay, how do we right the ship?
Let's just talk about that writing the ship thing. Your book, the current sort of hardback edition, finishes effective in 2023 at a point when Marvel is about to head not just into some complex storytelling territory, which may or may not work, but some complex political and social territory, quite major. One event of which, of course, was going to have a major impact on their ability to build any forms of continuity into the multiverse, as I understand it. So can we talk about the sort of big, as it were, breakout political, social, controversial headline events, which in the last year or so have massively, at least, affected the trajectory of Marvel Studios? So I'm talking about Victoria Alonso, I'm talking about Jonathan Majors. So what we've got to say about them?
Dave?
So the Victoria Alonso situation, I actually it was very rushed because it happened in like February and March of 2023 as we were putting the final touches on the book. But all praise to Joanna Robinson, who immediately when she heard it was happening, just like started calling everybody that knew Victoria Alonso. And we were able to get in touch with her and her team before any sort of deal was made. So we were still in a period where it's like maybe Victoria Alonso has legal action against Marvel for being dismissed. So I do think the version of what happened in our book is the most detailed version we might ever get. I don't know what deal was signed. We didn't get, do any follow-up on that for the new chapter. But she has definitely not talked about it since. The book that she was supposed to put out, sort of like her autobiography, I think is not coming out anymore. So just this idea that there was some friction between how big Marvel had gotten and what they were still sort of asking her to do as a queer woman. She sort of started pushing back against that. I think very specifically in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, they wanted some gay pride flags that appeared in the San Francisco scenes edited out so they could sell, more Dubai screenings or what have you. And she was like, no, and they did it behind her back, and that caused a rift that never healed and eventually led to her dismissal. So that's very interesting to me because when she got dismissed, there was this narrative that she might have been like somewhat toxic or that she was causing the VFX departments to be like overworked or whatnot. That is just an industry problem. I don't think that's the Victoria Alonso problem. I think you see that across, whether it be Marvel Studios or really a big sort of visual effects movie for any studio. The way that we sort of work with visual effects is broken in Hollywood. And hopefully by the establishment of unions, of which Marvel and Disney are, the Marvel sect inside of Disney is helping spearhead the idea of a VFX union now. Like those are really going to help change the system. But Victoria Alonso just really ran into a culture clash and held a line that she should have held, and they went around her back and did it. And I do think that's like she didn't want to keep quiet and carry on as like a monolith of Marvel Studios. She wanted to step out and get the accolades for what she'd actually done. And that sort of ran afoul some things that they were asking her to do, and maybe she didn't. But definitely with Victoria Alonso, it was more of like an internal studio culture class than it was this VFX thing, which I think was part of like the scapegoating that people like saw. Oh, these movies that like haven't been doing that well, she was the VFX like artist, or she was the end of the line of the VFX for like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. But I'm also happy that that's been sort of unrolled because she's also one of the executive producers of X-Men '97. People love that. So it's all a matter of like sort of a disagreement with how to best represent Marvel that led to her departure. And now I don't know if we'll ever hear what she really thinks about it. She sort of had to be dismissed and walked away.
Maybe 5 years from now.
Exactly. Gavin, do you want to take Jonathan Majors?
Yeah.
So I think the thing to think of Jonathan Majors is that Marvel has had a very hard time building up their roster of headlining stars in the last few years. They did very, very well, sort of like Robert Downey Jr. and introducing people like Chris Pratt and, sort of like, and Chris Evans becomes a star and Chris Hemsworth. So like they did spectacularly well, and every bet they took turned out like even better than they could have hoped for. But then, sort of like some like things like go wrong, and sort of like it is a tragedy on multiple levels that Chadwick Boseman died as young. And that is somebody who I think they thought was like, he's going to be a real like sort of like flagship star for us. And you've got Tom Holland, who's sort of like legitimately turned into a star, but gets kind of caught in like the back and forth between Disney and Sony, Spider-Man movies. And then you have Brie Larson, who just sort of like gets like a full blast wave of misogyny from the internet when she stars in Captain Marvel. And so like the people that they're thinking of, this is the next generation, sort of like doesn't really turn out the way that they're hoping for. And then, sort of like Jonathan Majors, they cast in a relatively, just like they thought it was going to be a one-off of like, oh, he'll be the bad guy in, sort of Quantumania. And he does so well and has such a presence that's like, let's put him in everything. And then, of course, he turns out, he is, sort of found guilty in a court of law for assaulting a woman, and people don't want to see him on screen anymore. So, which I don't think anybody involved knew. So you have a situation where, sort of like, assuming that, like Marvel, like had the best goodwill in the world with all of this, sort of like it feels much more snake bit than it did. That, sort of they're still casting around, figuring out like who are our stars. And that's when you start people saying things like, what if we just like backed up dump trucks full of cash to like the original Avengers and brought them back? That they just really are looking for like movie stars who can star in their movies right now. And they seem to be somewhat at a loss of who those people might be.
We've got 2 minutes left. So I suppose it's the obvious forward-looking question. We've got Deadpool Wolverine coming up, wisecracking, Matthew Machismo, all sorts of stuff. I mean, that's going to be great fun. There's a lot of buzz around the Fantastic Four, particularly around the casting of the Fantastic Four. Maybe they'll finally get it right. We'll never know. We'll see. What are your personal hopes for the next big event in the Marvel universe? If you could say to Kevin Feige, please do this, what would it be? Gavin first, and then Dave, and then we'll call it the evening.
I want to see them just like not worry so much about the big arc, and just, sort of like my favorite things Marvel has done recently are the smaller things. Like, let's do Werewolf by Night and just have it be like weird and fun. So like my dream Marvel project right now is do a Squirrel Girl movie, just have it be charming, have it be funny, don't worry about like whether she's an Avenger. Just like entertain us with something unexpected for a couple hours at a time, and everything else will take care of itself.
I'm a big fan of Squirrel Girl as well. I agree with you on that one. Dave?
Now that we have Charlie Cox's Deadpool back, I would like to see Spider-Man get to interact with more of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think Spider-Man Daredevil movie and a Spider-Man Deadpool movie and a Spider-Man Wolverine movie are all three characters where it's like, I love their comic book interactions. I would love to see that on screen. And also it's like, that's a complicated thing because Sony owns Spider-Man, but also like every time Sony puts out a movie, they're like, we're getting to Spider-Man. And I know they're not getting to Spider-Man because we got another Marvel Spider-Man movie coming up. So every time I see something like Madam Web not be able to say that baby's Peter Parker at the end of it, I'm like, I can't wait for another Marvel Spider-Man movie so I get to see something that's recognizably Spider-Man. So I can't wait to whenever they announce it, which I hope is this year, whatever Tom Holland and Amy Pascal and Kevin Feige are cooking up for us in the Spider-Man Marvel universe.
Okay, so Gavin Edwards, Dave Gonzales, and in her absence, but clearly her journalism has featured all the way through this, Joanna Robinson. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. I hope the audience have enjoyed it. I hope we've managed to answer your questions in one way or another. Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening.